Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. It's a Wednesday evening, Silmarillionaires. Good Lord, can I start over? This is a terrible beginning. I can't even talk. And that's going to be a problem because we have a huge undertaking ahead of us this week. We have quite the journey. So, open up that leaf of lembas bread, baked by the Queen of the Elves herself. Only the Queen can do it. We're going to learn that in this week's reading. Unfold your map and plot our course because we have a long way to go as we strengthen the siege of Angband and secure centuries of peace. We study the Almanac of Beleriand, though not as deeply as you might fear, honestly. We learn of Beleriand's realms, and we hear the words of Ulmo and build Gondolin. We create this super secret city of the elves, and finally, and unexpectedly, pass the Bechdel-Wallace test. Yes, here in the pages of the Silmarillion. This week, the rest of Chapter 13 of The Return of the Noldor, then a quick world tour in Chapter 14 of Beleriand and its realms, and then into Chapter 15 of the Noldor and Beleriand. It is a lot, but it is manageable, mostly because I have taken a pair of scissors to my slides for Chapter 14. We're going to abridge that a little bit while still delivering to you everything that you need in order to navigate the chapters that flow thereafter. So just like last week, in fact, because I'm not going to spend too much time on the literal physical geography of Beleriand, it would probably be helpful to you to have lotrproject.com open in another window on another device somewhere nearby, print it all out. I don't know if you can do that, but maybe you can. Just have a map of Beleriand nearby. That will help you navigate, certainly, that chapter. Unless, Silmarillionaires, we have all just successfully internalized the map of Middle-earth as it has been presented to us, which I know I have. I'm sure you have too. Last time, we saw the death of Fëanor. We witnessed the Dagor Nuin Gilead, the battle beneath the stars, the second of the great battles of Beleriand. We saw the rescue of Maithros by Fingon, thanks to the foresight of Manwë and the intervention of Thorondor, king of the eagles. Fingolfin took the throne as High King of the Noldor. We saw friction amongst the Noldor and the departure of Maithros to the marches south of Angband and Caranthir, still further east, so that he can trade with the dwarves and enrich himself. And as I noted at the end of last week's session, we're about to see time accelerate first, and then we're going to rewind, right? In the next reading, we're going to get a number of vignettes that jump here and there, and then we're going to rewind all the way back to the beginning, essentially, so that we can see actually what happens on the other side of Beleriand and its realms. Good evening to Galadriel Becky, who is joining me here in the chat, and Glorfin David, who has not yet said anything, but I'm assuming is lurking nearby. Let's get into what is sure to be a long journey tonight with Chapter 13 of The Return of the Noldor, Part 2, picking up from where we left off last week with 20 years later, a feast. When 20 years of the sun had passed, Fingolfin, king of the Noldor, made a great feast, and it was held in the spring near to the pools of Ivrin, whence the swift river Narog rose, for there the lands were green and fair at the feet of the mountains of shadow that shielded them from the north. The joy of that feast was long remembered in later days of sorrow, and it was called Mereth Adarthad, the Feast of Reuniting. Thither came many of the chieftains and people of Fingolfin and Finrod, and of the sons of Fëanor, Maithros and Maglor, with warriors of the eastern march. And there came also great numbers of the grey elves, wanderers of the woods of Beleriand, and the folk of the havens with Círdan, their lord. There came even green elves from Assyriand, the land of seven rivers, far off under the walls of the blue mountains. But out of Doriath there came but two messengers, Mablung and Dairon, bearing greetings from the king. At Mereth Adarthad many counsels were taken in goodwill, and oaths were sworn of league and friendship. And it is told that at this feast the tongue of the grey elves was most spoken even by the Noldor, for they learned swiftly the speech of Beleriand, whereas the Sindar were slow to master the tongue of Valinor. The hearts of the Noldor were high and full of hope, and to many among them it seemed that the words of Fëanor had been justified, bidding them seek freedom and fair kingdoms in Middle-earth. And indeed there followed after long years of peace, while their swords fenced Beleriand from the ruin of Morgoth, and his power was shut behind his gates. In those days there was joy beneath the new sun and moon, and all the land was glad, but still the shadow brooded in the north. So, this is the year 20, right? After 20 years of the sun had passed, we're not talking 20 years from the last event that we witnessed, but rather 20 years from the rising of the sun. This is in fact 13 years after the release of Maithros from Morgoth's imprisonment, and the moment where Maithros surrenders any right to the throne of the Noldor to Fingolfin, which is to say that it takes him some time to decide to reunite the branches of the House of Finwë here in Beleriand. And if we have been paying close attention as we move through the Silmarillion, we might be feeling a little tense as we begin this passage, because historically, feasts, celebrations of any kind, have been dangerous things. It's during a party in Almaran, back in the first version of Arda, that Melkor destroys the lamps. It's during the festival at Taniquetil that Melkor and Ungoliant destroy the trees of Valinor. But this time, nothing bad happens. We're in a different kind of narrative mode here because, yes, superficially, everything is great, right? Many councils were taken in goodwill and oaths were sworn of league and friendship. And all this time, we're speaking Sindarin, too, because the Noldor have picked up Sindarin more rapidly than the Grey Elves have picked up the Quenya, the Noldorian Quenya, that the Noldor have brought back with them from Valinor. But there is still this threat. There is still this danger. They're followed after long years of peace while their swords fenced Beleriand from the ruin of Morgoth, but still the shadow brooded in the north. This is also where we meet Mablung of the Sindarin for the first time, and this is the second time that we meet Daeron the Minstrel. He was introduced back in Chapter 10 as the inventor of Cirth, the runic language that he invents, that the dwarves don't, that the elves don't care much for, but the dwarves really love. Both of these characters will show up again later. So it's interesting to think of this comparison here, this forcible comparison between the Noldor and the Sindar, and particularly as we see that through the languages, of course. This is going to be a recurring... If you're inclined toward a drinking game, drink every time I say foreshadowing in tonight's session, because there's so much of it. Even here, even as we're looking at the language, we've been talking for chapters now about the pivot from the mostly Quenyan naming convention of this book to now the mostly Sindarin naming convention of this book. We are now getting names almost exclusively in Sindarin as we move through these chapters, and that's for a very good reason, which we will get to later in tonight's reading, but it is foreshadowed here by the Noldor picking up the speech of Beleriand, whereas the Sindar are slow to master the tongue of Valinor. And I think you can definitely draw conclusions, I think, about the role of society in language, right? There are two real ways, I think, of interpreting this. The one is the Noldor are just extra special, shiny, fantastic, right? They have been to Valinor. They are Calaquendi. They have seen the light of the trees of Valinor. They arrive back in Middle-earth with that light still shining in their face, and they are just better. They are just awesome. Their ability scores are just hotter than the Sindar are. But I think there's something else here happening, because what we have seen consistently is the fracturing and the dissolution of the Noldori, right? We have seen the houses of Finwë kind of splinter apart, right? We're not complete. There isn't a unified Noldor identity the way that there is very much a unified Sindar identity. And I think that Tolkien is leaning here into the idea that language, well, springs forth from community, springs forth from society, springs forth from a specific relationship to the landscape. We're going to circle back to this later in this week's reading when we get to Beleriand and its realms, in fact. But I want to be thinking about how and why languages develop, what distinguishes strong languages from weak languages, and what distinguishes the use and facility, the utility of a lingua franca in the context of fractured societies, almost at this point, 20 years into the presence of Fingolfin's family here in Middle-earth, right? We're basically still leading a somewhat nomadic existence. A large thing that we're going to focus on in this week's reading is going to be the settling down of the Noldori back here in Beleriand. But the Sindar have been here. They've been building this society. They have been building this sense of themselves and this unified identity as Grey Elves, as Sindar. I'll note here, too, the green elves here showing up from Assyrian. There came green elves from Assyrian, the land of seven rivers far off under the walls of the Blue Mountains. The green elves are not going to do a lot, right? They're not going to do that much after the death of their ruler Denethor during that first unnamed battle in Beleriand. The first of the 5 big battles of Beleriand that doesn't even get a name because it's before the Noldor show up and start naming things, right? We're going to talk about the second of these, or I guess the second of the named battles, the third of these battles overall, in just a little while. So, a successful party thrown by Fingolfin. Everyone's feeling pretty good about coming back to Middle-earth. In those days, there was joy beneath the new sun and moon, and all the land was glad, but still the shadow brooded in the north, right? Classic Tolkien inversion there, and foreshadowing the rise of danger once more. So from here, we're going to skip ahead another 30 years. And when again 30 years had passed, Turgon, son of Fingolfin, left Neverest, where he dwelt, and sought out Finrod his friend upon the island of Tolsirion, and they journeyed southward along the river, being weary for a while of the northern mountains. And as they journeyed, night came upon them beyond the meres of twilight beside the waters of Sirion, and they slept upon his banks beneath the summer stars. But Ulmo, coming up the river, laid a deep sleep upon them and heavy dreams. And the trouble of the dreams remained after they awoke. But neither said aught to the other, for their memory was not clear, and each believed that Ulmo had sent a message to him alone. But unquiet was upon them ever after, and doubt of what should befall, and they wandered often alone in untrodden lands, seeking far and wide for places of hidden strength, for it seemed to each that he was bidden to prepare for a day of evil, and to establish a retreat, lest Morgoth should burst from Angband and overthrow the armies of the north. Now on a time, Finrod and Galadriel his sister were the guests of Thingol their kinsman in Doriath. Then Finrod was filled with wonder at the strength and majesty of Menegroth, its treasuries and armories and its many pillared halls of stone, and it came into his heart that he would build wide halls behind ever guarded gates in some deep and secret place beneath the hills. Therefore he opened his heart to Thingol, telling him of his dreams, and Thingol spoke to him of the deep gorge of the river Narog, and the caves under the high Pharith and its steep western shore. And when he departed, he gave him guides to lead him to that place of which few yet knew. Thus Finrod came to the caverns of Narog, and began to establish their deep halls and armories after the fashion of the mansions of Menegroth, and that stronghold was called Nargothrond. In that labour Finrod was aided by the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, and they were rewarded well, for Finrod had brought more treasures out of Tirion than any other of the princes of the Noldor. And in that time was made for him the Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, most renowned of the works in the elder days. It was a carcanet of gold, and set therein were gems uncounted from Valinor, but it had a power within it, so that it rested lightly on its wearer as a strand of flax, and whatsoever neck it clasped, it sat always with grace and loveliness. From the construction of a new city for the elves to a really nice piece of jewelry. Let's take a look here at this opening sequence. 30 more years, as I say, so we're now in the year 50 of the sun. Turgon, son of Fingolfin, leaves Neverest, goes to find Finrod, his friend. They journey southward. They're looking for something. They're feeling this urge of adventure upon them. They sleep by the meres of twilight beside the waters of Sirion, and Ulmo comes and lays upon them a mighty whammy. He lays upon them this great compulsion, these dreams and heavy purpose. And it's interesting. We're going to be talking a lot tonight about what Ulmo knows and how we are supposed to interpret prophecy, how we are supposed to interpret foresightedness, how we are supposed to interpret this deeper knowledge that arises of what will come next in Middle-earth. And I'm reminded here in particular of the song, right? I'm reminded here of the Ainulindalë, and I'm reminded of the ways in which each individual mind of the Ainur is disconnected from the others. Initially, they know only of their own domain, and it is only later, through, in part, the singing of the song and the singing together, that they arrive at comprehension and an understanding of the minds around them. And here, I think we're seeing a little echo of that. I think we're getting a familiar rhyme with something earlier in Tolkien's work. Ulmo here is sending them these dreams, but they each believe that they are destined themselves alone to fulfill those dreams, so they don't talk, so they don't collaborate, so they don't reach an understanding of each other. Instead, they pursue these separate paths. Finrod, of course, so inspired by Menegroth, the Thousand Caves here in Doriath, really wants to build something underground. He really wants to mimic this great city of the elves. So he does. Thingol gives him all the aid he needs. He tells him where he can find suitable caverns, the caverns of Narog there. And Finrod hires the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and pays them in gems that he has taken from Valinor, right? You'll remember how the Noldor loved the gems that they could find so easily in Aman. Finrod takes more of them than any other prince of the Noldor. He just carries this wealth with him. And I would hesitate here just to emphasize that there's no sense, I think, of a functioning economy among the Noldor here, right? It's not that he is carrying wealth. It is that he is carrying things of beauty. It is that he is carrying things which have an innate value, not a fungible value. He's not bringing with him, sacks with a $sign on the side. He's bringing a collection of gems because he really loves the beauty of those gems. But it turns out that they have utility. It turns out that you can spend those gems in exchange for goods and services, specifically the services of the dwarves of the Blue Mountains to construct Nargothrond. You'll note here, too, the distinction between Nargothrond and Menegroth is that the dwarves don't take payment for working on Menegroth because they are so inspired by Melian, right? They're so rewarded by Melian. It's a beautiful kind of reciprocal relationship there, but this is much more businesslike. The dwarves now just accepting hard, cold cash. Galadriel is asking, do you think Turgon and Finrod are looking for personal glory or just not working together because they're kind of getting lost in their own ideas? I think it's much more the latter. I think that establishing that Turgon and Finrod are friends, right there in the second line on this slide, establishing that they are friends and that they are undertaking this journey together and that they are in some way incompletely interpreting the vision of Ulmo, but again, it's hard to know exactly what it is that Ulmo is doing and why. We'll put a pin in Ulmo for now because I want to circle. We're going to have a more direct prophecy when we return, in fact, to Turgon and the founding of Gondolin in Chapter 15 toward the end of this week's reading. But there's a lot to talk about there. Certainly here, it's difficult, right? Unquiet was upon them ever after, and doubt of what should befall, and they wandered often alone in untrodden lands. It feels as though they are bearing this burden alone. It feels as though it's less a pursuit of personal glory or like a great mission has been given them, but they are troubled, right? That's the word that we get. The trouble lingers even after they wake. Yeah. Okay. Let's, do I have anything else to say here before? Oh, of course I have something else to say here. I have to talk about the Nauglamir, literally the necklace of the Nauglir, the dwarves, right? Nauglamir, the necklace of the dwarves, a carcanet, which is a beautifully archaic word for necklace from the French originally that comes into English, I think in the 13th century there or thereabouts. This is a word that I think I genuinely learned as what a teen from Bilbo's Song of Eärendil in Rivendell, right? He gets this great stanza, halfway through the poem there. Then flying Elwing came to him, and flame was in the darkness lit, more bright than light of diamond, the fire upon her carcanet. That was my first exposure, I believe, to the word carcanet, and it left quite the impression, as all of the lines of that poem did. So now we have Nargothrond, right? It is... I should mention too, since we're acknowledging foreshadowing, and since I set you this task of pursuing a drinking game, hey, Nauglamir is just foreshadowing. Nauglamir is going to be, as the text tells us, most renowned of their works in the elder days, right? This is a super serious piece of jewelry that is being gifted here, that is being, transacted in some sense here for Finrod. It is going to be very significant later. We will come back to it in the future. So, with all of that said, let's move into Nargothrond itself. There in Nargothrond, Finrod made his home with many of his people, and he was named in the tongue of the dwarves Felagund, hewer of caves, and that name he bore thereafter until his end. But Finrod Felagund was not the first to dwell in the caves beside the river Narog. Galadriel, his sister, went not with him to Nargothrond, for in Doriath dwelt Celeborn, kinsman of Thingol, and there was great love between them. Therefore she remained in the hidden kingdom and abode with Melian, and of her learned great lore and wisdom concerning Middle-earth. But Turgon remembered the city set upon a hill, Tirion the fair, with its tower and tree, and he found not what he sought, but returned to Tenevrist, and sat in peace in Vinyamar by the shores of the sea. And in the next year Ulmo himself appeared to him, and bade him go forth again alone into the vale of Sirion. And Turgon went forth, and by the guidance of Ulmo he discovered the hidden value of Tumladen in the encircling mountains, in the midst of which there was a hill of stone. Of this he spoke to none as yet, but returned once more to Nevrist, and there began in his secret councils to devise the plan of a city after the manner of Tirion upon Tuna, for which his heart yearned in exile. So we see the comparison here, right? Finrod drawing inspiration from Menegroth and really replicating Menegroth, honestly, in Nargothrond, but Turgon can't get it. Why can't Turgon get it? Because he remembered the city set upon the hill, Tirion the fair with its tower and tree, and he found not what he sought. There is a thing within Turgon that is still yearning for Valinor. He is not where he wants to be. So Ulmo does him a real solid and leads him to Tumladen, right, to the wide valley here amidst the encircling mountains, the very literally named encircling mountains, this site that will be perfect for the replication of Tirion upon Tuna, but not upon this grassy hill lifted here in the Calacaria, but upon this mound of stone, right, where we're going to see again and again how Gondolin, as great as it is, and it is great, how it is a pale imitation of Tirion upon Tuna, and how it betrays a dissatisfaction, a discomfort, and an unease in Turgon's heart, a sense that Turgon, as I say, is not where he ought to be. Two powerful bits of foreshadowing here too before we even get to that. We get the name by which Finrod is most commonly known. He, like Luthien, I want to say. Luthien Tenuvial is very commonly used. We don't normally name the elves by different versions of the name. We don't give them this construct of first name, last name, right? But we often do with Luthien, and we almost always do with Finrod Felagund. That's a very, very rich tradition here. This is not actually a Sindarin word. It is a kind of Elvenized Kuzdul, the language of the dwarves. This is the dwarven word Felak Gundu, which means hewer of caves, digger of caves. It's a literal translation into something that sounds vaguely Sindarin, right? Felagund there. The reference to the previous inhabitants of these caves will pay off when we get all the way to Turin Turambar in chapter 21. We're a long way from that, but maybe we should remember the petty dwarves that live in this part of Beleriand prior to the coming of the Noldor. And then we get a kind of sidestep. We get a kind of a little Christopher Tolkien two-step here as we avoid, as much as we can, the issue of Galadriel. I mentioned in the Q&A last week and quoted Christopher, in fact, saying that basically there are no stories in the Legendarium more complicated than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. So we basically skip right past it. We keep just the core of the story, which is that she has to be in Doriath because she has to be able to talk to Melian. That is going to be extremely important in the pages to come. So this is it. We founded Nargothrond. Finrod is happy amidst his caves. He's happy with his Nauglamir, his very fancy necklace that looks like it could maybe use, I don't know, one more gem just to like perfect it, but maybe we'll find something suitable down the road. And Turgon is caught up, right? He spends a year just burning the midnight oil trying to figure out a place to build his city until Ulmo leads him by the hand to the hidden vale of Tumladen and the site of what will one day be Gondolin. But, as we knew, the shadow still lurks in the north. Morgoth isn't done yet, and we have to get to the Dagor Aglarab. Now Morgoth, believing the report of his spies that the lords of the Noldor were wandering abroad with little thought of war, made trial of the strength and watchfulness of his enemies. Once more, with little warning, his might was stirred, and suddenly there were earthquakes in the north, and fire came from fissures in the earth, and the iron mountains vomited flame, and orcs poured forth across the plain of Ardgalan. Thence they thrust down the pass of Sirion in the west, and in the east they burst through the land of Maglor, in the gap between the hills of Maithros and the outliers of the Blue Mountains. But Fingolfin and Maithros were not sleeping. And while others sought out the scattered bands of orcs that strayed in Beleriand and did great evil, they came upon the main host from either side as it was assaulting Dorthonion, and they defeated the servants of Morgoth, and pursuing them across Ardgalan, destroyed them utterly, to the least and last, within sight of Angban's gates. That was the third great battle of the Wars of Beleriand, and it was named Dagor Aglarab, the Glorious Battle. So Morgoth tries a third time, right? This is the third big battle of Beleriand. It's the second with a name. This name is something a little different, but like the others, it has resulted in the ruinous defeat of the orcs. The elves, the Noldor in particular, are just real good at what they do. They are formidable. This is, as I say, another resounding success, though I think we're beginning to see something shift a little. I think we're beginning to see something that to the modern reader, particularly the reader familiar with The Lord of the Rings, right, should read like an urge for caution, an urge that perhaps we are becoming too settled in this conflict. Because we've had this naming convention arise, right? The first battle goes unnamed, primarily because the Noldor aren't around to like document it here in the pages of the Quenta Silmarillion, right? But the second is easy. It's the battle under stars. That's all it has to it. It is kind of temporarily rooting this conflict at a particular time and place. But this, the glorious battle, and I can't read the word glorious in the pages of Tolkien without thinking, of course, of Faramir, right? I can't think of it without thinking of I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they protect, which is not to say that glory is a bad thing. It's not to say that swords shouldn't be sharp, or that arrows shouldn't be swift, or that warriors shouldn't be glorious. But loving the glory, loving the glory to the point that you name a battle the glorious battle, maybe isn't the path to righteousness. Maybe this isn't the path of wisdom. Maybe the Noldor are getting a little entrenched in the conflict and in their victories, rather than addressing the underlying need of Beleriand. That, of course, is going to come back to haunt them in the future. But the victory itself is incomplete. It is more of a warning, perhaps, than a reason for celebration, as we'll see here in the next slide. A victory it was, and yet a warning, and the princes took heed of it, and thereafter drew closer their leaguer, and strengthened and ordered their watch, setting the siege of Angband, which lasted well nigh 400 years of the sun. For a long time after Dagor Aglareb, no servant of Morgoth would venture from his gates, for they feared the lords of the Noldor, and Fingolfin boasted that save by treason among themselves, Morgoth could never again burst from the leaguer of the Eldar, nor come upon them unawares. Yet the Noldor could not capture Angband, nor could they regain the Silmarils, and war never wholly ceased in all the time of the siege, for Morgoth devised new evils, and ever and anon he would make trial of his enemies. Nor could the stronghold of Morgoth be ever wholly encircled, for the Iron Mountains, from whose great curving wall the towers of Thangorodrim were thrust forward, defended it upon either side, and were impassable to the Noldor because of their snow and ice. Thus in his rear and to the north Morgoth had no foes, and by that way his spies at times went out, and came by devious routes into Beleriand. And desiring above all to sow fear and disunion among the Eldar, he commanded the orcs to take alive any of them that they could, and bring them bound to Angband. And some he so daunted by the terror of his eyes that they needed no chains more, but walked ever in fear of him, and doing his will wherever they might be. Thus Morgoth learned much of all that had befallen since the rebellion of Feanor, and he rejoiced, seeing therein the seed of many dissensions among his foes. So, a victory and a warning. The tightening of the siege of Angband is a pivotal point in the history of Beleriand because, in some senses, yes, it secures essentially 400 years of peace. The leaguer here just means the siege. They are opposing Angband with military force. They are attempting as much as they can, given the geography that we're dealing with here, to encircle Angband and to prevent Morgoth from sallying forth. It's incomplete, but it is still largely effective. Leaguer is an archaic word. I think I talked a little about this last week, that we don't use very often now in English, except in the formulation of beleaguer, right? To be beleaguered is to be besieged by troubles, by foes, by enemies. So we are engaging in this siege of Angband, and it is largely successful. It is at least visibly successful. It is successful if your measure of success includes things like the glorious battle. Because that's not what Morgoth is doing now. Now he is sending out spies. Now he is sending out orcs. Now he is capturing elves and bringing them back to Angband, and by the terror of his eyes, turning them, breaking them, shattering them. It is a cruelty that is absolutely in line with his creation of the orcs in the first place, the taking of the elves way back at Cuivanan, right? And presumably the Avari too, as we've been hinted before. So this is, as I say, a real turning point in the future of Beleriand, but it is also crucially, I think, sowing the seeds of the destruction of Beleriand, which we'll get to in pages to come. It is also interesting, I think, to note that Angband, that the translation of Angband is somewhat ambiguous, right? That it is simultaneously the hell of iron, right? The fortress of iron in a sense, but it is also the prison of iron, and now Morgoth is the one crucially imprisoned here, though, as we say, incompletely. Thus Morgoth learned much of all that had befallen since the rebellion of Feanor, and he rejoiced, seeing therein the seed of many dissensions among his foes. Well, that's the strategy that keeps working, right? Sending orcs out en masse, not really terribly effective for Morgoth, hasn't really secured a lot of W's for Team Bad Guy, but sowing dissension just keeps paying off. It just keeps working, and it's fascinating. This is true, I think, throughout the Legendarium. It's fascinating to think of, as we marshal these great military forces, as we engage in these great military campaigns, right? Tolkien writes so beautifully and crisply and dramatically and heroically about these great military conflicts, these great battles of history, of deeply mythological history here, right? The evil forces of Middle-earth, whether it's Morgoth here or it's Sauron much later, never really achieved that much through force of arms. They achieve what they achieve through this kind of deceit, through this kind of deception, through this kind of manipulation of other minds. They put and twist the tools of good to their own purpose. And that, well, as I say, that's the strategy that keeps on paying off, as it will again here. Let's skip forward to another attempt. When nearly 100 years had run since the Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth endeavoured to take Fingolfin at unawares, for he knew of the vigilance of Maethros. And he sent forth an army into the White North, and they turned west and again south and came down the coasts to the Firth of Drengist, by the route that Fingolfin followed from the grinding ice. Thus they would enter into the realm of Hithlum from the west. But they were espied in time, and Fingon fell upon them among the hills at the head of the Firth, and most of the orcs were driven into the sea. This was not reckoned among the great battles, for the orcs were not great in number, and only a part of the people of Hithlum fought there. But thereafter there was peace for many years, and no open assault from Angband, for Morgoth perceived now that the orcs unaided were no match for the Noldor, and he sought in his heart for new counsel. So if at first you don't succeed, throw another army of orcs at the problem, and maybe it'll work. And when it doesn't work, well, just bide your time and come up with something more, I don't know, dragon-shaped. Have we considered something dragon-shaped? That seems like that might work. Again, right? We're seeing the complete dominance of the Noldor. We're seeing, crucially, I think, the arrogance of the Noldor, right? Which I understand is a dangerous word, but it does seem to be appropriate here because the orc force is espied in time, and Fingon falls upon them among the hills at the head of the Firth, right? Drives them into the sea, right? A great victory. But he doesn't take all of his people with him. Only a part of the people of Hithlum fought there. Had he been wrong, or had the orcs just had a good day, or had some other force been at play, he might not have been so successful. He might not have won such an overwhelming victory. Now, it turns out, of course, that the victory is overwhelming. And when we note here Morgoth's change of heart, when we note our understanding of Morgoth's plan, that has to be taken, I think, with a giant pinch of salt. Because how do the Noldor know the mind of Morgoth during this extended peace, right? We have the glorious battle. We have 100 years of peace following that after the tightening of the siege around Angband. Morgoth sends out another force to really carefully kind of wend their way around to the northwest and hit Hithlum from the back. And what happens? They are completely destroyed. Well, okay. Do we really think, given that it's not a terribly large force, right? The orcs are not in great number. Do we think that this is just another legitimate attempt by Morgoth to try and overrun the Noldor with fewer people than he had before? Or is this part of some larger plan? Is this part of some larger ploy? Is this part of some deeper deceit from Morgoth? Well, it's impossible, really, to get to, but we ought always, I think, particularly given how painstakingly Professor Tolkien lays out the perspective of the documents that comprise the Quintus Silmarillion in particular, but really the Silmarillion as a whole. Given how carefully in perspective these documents are, we probably ought not to just assume that the Noldori have an infinite and omniscient understanding of Morgoth's moves and maneuvers. So he tries the orcs don't work, and then we have to try something else. Again, after 100 years, Glaurung, the first of the Uruloki, the fire drakes of the north, issued from Angband's gates by night. He was yet young and scarce half grown, for long and slow was the life of dragons, but the elves fled before him to arid Wethrin and Dorthonion in dismay, and he defiled the fields of Ardgalan. Then Fingon, prince of Hithlum, rode against him with archers on horseback, and hemmed him round with a ring of swift riders, and Glaurung could not endure their darts, being not yet come to his full armoury, and he fled back to Angband, and came not forth again for many years. Fingon won great praise, and the Noldor rejoiced, for few foresaw the full meaning and threat of this new thing. But Morgoth was ill-pleased that Glaurung had disclosed himself oversoon, and after his defeat there was the long peace of well-nigh 200 years. In all that time there were but affrays on the marches, and all Beleriand prospered and grew rich. Behind the guard of their armies in the north, the Noldor built their dwellings and their towers, and many fair things they made in those days, and poems, and histories, and books of lore. In many parts of the land, the Noldor and the Sindar became welded into one people, and spoke the same tongue. Though this difference remained between them, that the Noldor had the greater power of mind and body, and were the mightier warriors and sages, and they built with stone, and loved the hill slopes and open lands. But the Sindar had the fairer voices, and were more skilled in music, save only Maglor, son of Feanor, and they loved the woods and the riversides, and some of the grey elves still wandered far and wide without settled abode, and they sang as they went. So we're seeing, through victory, the militarization of the Noldor. They are becoming a military people. They are becoming a militaristic people. They are becoming a people accustomed to being constantly at war. Yes, the long peace endures 100 years until the orcs sneak into Hithlum through the back door, 100 years before Glaurung comes forth from Angband and is roundly defeated by Fingon, Prince of Hithlum, and then 200 years of peace. But what happens in that peace is not plan for the ultimate conquest of Angband. The Noldor seem happy with this state of constant warfare, and we're drawing that distinction very carefully here at the end, contrasting it with the Sindar, right? The Noldor, okay, the Noldor and the Sindar, they're hanging out for reasons which we will see. They're basically just talking the same language now. They're kind of functionally becoming one people, except, of course, the Calaquendi, those elves who have been to Valinor, who saw the light of the trees, are just way better. They are elves plus plus. All of their stats are better. They've got more perks. They've got more feats. They're like levels and levels ahead of the Sindar. But the Sindar are maybe happier, are maybe more free, are maybe more true to themselves. They aren't as great. They aren't the mightier warriors and sages. But the Sindar have the fairer voices, and we know how important singing is, right? And I love the exception here. Save only Maglor, son of Fëanor. Maglor, who is referred to as Maglor the singer so often, right? The Sindar have the fairer voices and were more skilled in music, and they loved the woods and the riversides, and some of the Grey Elves still wandered far and wide without settled abode, and they sang as they went. We're seeing the Noldor become fixed in place. We're seeing the Noldor become kind of unelven in their commitment to fortresses and skill at arms, to this constant ongoing war. Yes, it's 200 years of peace, well, except for all the fights, except for the affrays on the marches, right? Except for this kind of constant grinding friction of conflict up there in the north. Meanwhile, all of Beleriand prospers and grows rich. Behind the guard of their armies, the Noldor build their dwellings and their towers and many fair things they made in those days, and poems and histories and books of lore, so they're not completely ruined. They're not completely gone. It's not too late for the Noldor, but we are seeing throughout this set of conflicts a pivot in our understanding of what the Noldor really are, of who the elves really are in Beleriand. We should, of course, talk about Glaurung, the first of the Urloki, the fire drakes of the north, the first dragon of Morgoth's creation. So he sends the orcs. The orcs don't work out. Dragons. Dragons is the obvious next step past orcs. Urloki translates directly as fire drake or straight up fire dragon. Crucially, and this is a thing that many struggle to remember, I honestly struggle to remember from time to time, crucially, Morgoth has at his disposal no creatures capable of flight. It is clear from what happens with Gondolin, which is, very close to Morgoth by the time it is constructed, that Morgoth has no creatures that can fly. Otherwise, Gondolin would have been discovered immediately. So we have to think of Glaurung, like the Balrog, as being wingless. And this can make a visual conceptualization of Glaurung particularly difficult, right? If you just take Smaug and strip off the wings, you're not going to get like a satisfying creature. That creature is going to be a little bit weird. I have seen fan art of Glaurung presenting him as something more like a basilisk, which is deeply upsetting, honestly, or something that almost versions of Glaurung that almost like style him as Godzilla, right? That style him as being more upright than the traditional great lizard, the great worm. Glaurung there, yes, the gold worm here is the direct literal translation, which we would take to mean an indication of the color of his scales, which aren't, of course, complete yet, right? He has not come to his full armory, we are told, which is why the archers of Fingon can hem him in with their arrows, with their darts, and send him back to Angband. Another moment of connection, another moment of familiarity for us here, because we all know that dragons are susceptible to the fire of a well-crafted bow. So, another 100 years. This takes us all the way to the year 455, the year of the sun, 455. And I'll reiterate again for those of you coming in late, the years of the sun, our years, right? So almost, 4.5 centuries effectively since we started this week's reading. 455 years since the sun first rises on Middle-earth. This is the end of chapter 13, and we're going to now rewind. We're going to spend the next 4 chapters, in fact, filling in more detail, going back basically to the beginning of this reading and filling in more detail, leading us up to this exact point, right? 200 years past the emergence of Glaurung and his defeat and retreat into Angband, and the displeasure of Morgoth there too, right? We established 200 years, the long piece of well nigh 200 years. That is, as of right now, kind of our terminal punctuation to the story of Beleriand. We're going to move past that, but not for several chapters. Instead, we're going to see, well, exactly where we are, and we're going to begin that with Chapter 14 of Beleriand and its realms, and we're going to begin with maps. I'm not going to spend too long on these, but we really should, I think, just appreciate them. This is what is known as the second Silmarillion map. This is drawn by Professor Tolkien in the late 1930s. Let me cancel out my own camera because no one needs to see me when we can see Professor Tolkien's artwork here. This is published in 2018. This comes from the book The Maker of Middle-earth, published in 2018 by Catherine McIlwain, who is the Tolkien archivist at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which, of all the jobs in the world, you guys, that has to be among the very, very best. So this is the second Silmarillion map, and you can see here many familiar elements. In fact, the geography is pretty much what we are going to see when we open up our copies of the Silmarillion, and we get the version of this map redrawn by Christopher. Let me move into this. You can basically see that it is the same. There are a couple of extremely minor changes, and I think one mistake, I forget exactly the detail of it, but Christopher reveals that he should have given 2 separate rivers the same source and doesn't. He differentiates between the sources, but honestly, I don't remember the detail of it because it doesn't matter that much. You may also, depending on your copy of the Silmarillion, if you have a later hardcover copy, which I somehow don't, by the way, which is strange to me. I need to pick up more copies of the Silmarillion, but if you have a later hardcover copy, you might have this colored version. This was covered by H.E. Riddett and is, a kind of elementary coloring job here, but it is more evocative, I think, for the presence of this color. And I want to show you these maps, not for the first time, of course, to emphasize, well, on one hand, how important this kind of geoaesthetic enterprise is to Professor Tolkien. I suppose, strictly speaking, less geoaesthetic and more like, cartoaesthetic, right? This isn't, the creation of landscapes, the creation of maps is not, of course, the most famous of Tolkien's secret vices. He didn't spend as much time tinkering with maps and with the lands of Middle-earth as he spends on his various constructed languages. But we can easily see the creation of these maps, I think, as a middle ground between the languages on one side and the narrative of these stories on the other. There needs to be a place for these languages to exist. This is the argument that he gives in basically the creation of the entire Legendarium, which, yes, we can cast a little doubt upon because of when certain stories were written and where the emphasis of the first phase of creation of the Legendarium is, but certainly this is the story that he tells later in his career. He begins this entire endeavor as a mythopoetic exercise, in part because he wants a coherent mythology of England, yes, but also, crucially, English. Part of what he bemoans in the absence of an English mythology is something that accounts for the evolution of this language that he loves so well in other places, right? Other places don't have the same acquisitive nature that England has. English has taken words from so many different stories. It is a mongrel kind of language. It is a bastardization of so many other language forms. It's not true in a sense to its roots. We might argue, from our perspective as happily modern people, that is in fact the source of its power, that is in fact its root, is that it is acquisitive, is that it is a nation of merchants and of travelers and of seafarers and of comfortable imperialists. That is in fact where English comes from, but Tolkien doesn't see it like that, and he wishes that there was this mythopoeic framework that accounts for the rise of the language as well as for the other aspects of the mythology, the etiological aspects of the mythology, because languages arise from specific places at specific times. Language is a product of culture. It is a product of community. It always is. And for Professor Tolkien, having no mythopoetic foundation for English kind of invalidates English as a language. Not completely, of course, but makes English less full-figured than other languages that emerge from their own mythological and geographical roots. I'll note here, I suppose, that for all of his enthusiasm for geography, right, in the abstract, Professor Tolkien was a less talented cartographer than he was a linguist. His sketches are pretty rough. I went back today, I took down a couple of my different copies of The Hobbit and was looking at the maps contained therein, right? Thorin's map, of course, the most famous map associated with The Hobbit, and then the map that we see at Rivendell too. And looking at just how rudimentary they are, how simple they are, how kind of almost iconographic they are. Obviously, by the time we get to the Silmarillion, we get a very different sense. Obviously, by the time we get to the Lord of the Rings, we get a very different sense. But that is because Professor Tolkien does not draw the maps in the Lord of the Rings. That's left to Christopher. Christopher draws those maps. Professor Tolkien creates painstaking notes and rough drafts of the maps, but the final versions are penned by Christopher, I think a more skilled cartographer than his father. And I'm mentioning all of this because this passage, this chapter of Beleriand and its realms poses a certain problem. It is not the first chapter of the Quenta Silmarillion that sits uncomfortably alongside the others. I mentioned of the sun and the moon, right, as a previous chapter, chapter 11, that seems ill at ease is judgmental, right? It's not clinical. That's not analytical language. That is interpretive language more. The analytical language is that it is in a different register. It is in a different mode than the chapters surrounding it. We include it because we wanted this accounting of an etiological myth. Professor Tolkien was very keen on this acting in its entirety as a functional mythological foundation for his understanding of the world, for the reader's understanding of the world too. And I think that of Beleriand and its realms functions in a similar way. I think that there are basically three things that we want from this chapter, which this chapter gives us. And all of them, I think, conspire to make the tone and the tenor of this chapter more difficult. We have just gear shifted down into a more narrative mode, right? But 2 weeks ago, I was saying, and the great news is now we're done dealing with this hierarchical order. Now we're done dealing with this historical rhetoric. Now we're going to move down into characters who have dialogue and have conflicts and have feelings. We're going to be in a more recognizable and traditional fantasy narrative mode. And that's true because we just got like a whole chapter of it. And now we're back out into this weirdly abstracted almanac of Beleriand. So I think that on the one hand, we want the development of this space. Professor Tolkien wants the development of this space, and we as eager readers want the development of this landscape because it is inextricably associated with the development of language, and language is Professor Tolkien's secret vice. That is the thing that he cares about, perhaps most, more even than the stories that spring forth from that language. The second thing I think that we see here is, as I mentioned a little last week, I think, a real affection on the part of Christopher Tolkien for the work that his father put into these maps and these landscapes and this world. The world itself is grand and glorious. And I think that if you read this description of Beleriand in some kind of, mid-century D&D source book, should such a thing have existed at the time, then you would be really inspired. I think that you can read this chapter and feel as though you're getting a sense of the geography of Beleriand in a way that perhaps isn't revolutionary. It's not going to completely transform your understanding of where we are or who our key players are or what the lines of political distinction and affiliation are at this point, but it is going to give you richness. It's going to give you richness of geography. It's going to give you richness of language. There are so many words throughout this entire chapter, and more so than ever, I think, they are directly translated. This is part of that slightly different tone. It's part of that slightly different register. This chapter is more like an almanac, more like an atlas, I suppose. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, here's the 1,000 words of description that we're going to get of Beleriand. The other thing, and I would say too, that neither of those previous facts, neither of those previous theories, neither of those previous reasons for the inclusion of this paragraph at this point in the Silmarillion, neither of those are bad. I think they are both admirable, in fact, though it does make for a slightly uncomfortable bit of reading. And I say uncomfortable reading, not because I don't enjoy this chapter, but I am what is known scientifically as a colossal nerd. I like this stuff, and that's a little atypical because, as I mentioned before, the consequence of this chapter appearing at this point in the book is that this is where readers stop reading. If you make it through the Vala Quenta, then oftentimes you are good until you hit of Beleriand and its realms. And if we could graph reader engagement through the Silmarillion as a whole, this is where we would see a calamitous fall off. Just many readers, anecdotally, are pushed out of the book at this point in exactly the same way as many readers are pushed out of The Lord of the Rings by the Council of Elrond, a chapter that I also really, really love. But I will admit, in my first reading of both books, I found both of these chapters very challenging. So I do understand that it's dry. It's really kind of giving you the thing of which Professor Tolkien is most frequently accused, right? Just this dry recitation of names and places and deep history that you cannot care about because you're not given an access point. You're not given an emotional hook to tie you into a story such that you can care about it, right? It is just someone telling you about this place that they made up. And it's hard to stay engaged sometimes. So we have the argument that this landscape is necessary as a development of language, which I concede. We have the argument that this is an act of respect and affection and comprehensivity from Christopher Tolkien, right? He wants to include this stuff in the Silmarillion because it was important to his dad. And that is reason enough for its inclusion, I think. The other thing that we absolutely have to recognize is that the Silmarillion comes out in 1977. And it's difficult sometimes for a modern reader to imagine what The Lord of the Rings must have been like if you came to it in the mid-60s, as so many readers did, right? It's kind of a hit upon its release, but it is really in the counterculture of the 1960s that it develops this all-encompassing life. It becomes a phenomenon in the 1960s, and there's nothing else. There's The Hobbit, but The Hobbit isn't like The Lord of the Rings. There's just this titanic, complex book with all of this impression of depth, all of this illusion of depth, all of this feeling that the world extends beyond the bounds of the page, that the world extends beyond the bounds of every single page in different directions to varying degrees, in different modes, in different narrative strategies, in different rhetorical strategies, that there's so much to this book because, of course, there was so much to this book. All 9/10 of the iceberg of The Lord of the Rings was underwater, and much of it can be found, at least in reference, in the Silmarillion. So I think that there is a desire here on behalf of Christopher Tolkien to pull out some of this geography, to pull out some of these deep lore elements and include them in the Silmarillion as a reward for the careful reader of The Lord of the Rings, right? Who is going to be the person who buys the Silmarillion upon its release in 77. And there's a lot of shared reference here, beyond the music of the chapter, beyond just the music of Tolkien's language, beyond the mellifluity of many of these words, which are just, I think, generally just stunning. There is a payoff here. If you read the Silmarillion first, then you're getting the impression of depth. You're getting, this is a phrase that Tolkien used, of course, impression of depth, these vast backcloths which sit behind the text but give the impression that the world is larger and wider and deeper and more complex and fascinating than the simple text on the page itself ever can. It is a thing that Tolkien basically perfects, and it is a thing that every fantasy author since Tolkien has been chasing. I'm saying that very confidently. I think it's absolutely true. There are very few fantasy authors, of course, who can give even the impression of depth, let alone the actual depth of Professor Tolkien. And the payoff for that is that he wrote 2 fantasy novels in his lifetime, 2 completed works that you can buy in a store, in effect. And I know several other volumes besides, but still. So when I'm talking about all of this, I should note too, right? While we're talking about the publication of the Silmarillion in 77, that's the year before the Ralph Bakshi animated Hobbit. Or no, it's the same year. 77 is the same year as the Ralph Bakshi animated Hobbit. It's the year before the first of the Ralph Bakshi animated Lord of the Rings movies. So there really is a dearth of new Lord of the Rings material, which is why people are falling in on this. I have here a couple of references that I wanted to pull out, right? Tying back to The Lord of the Rings, Elrond talks about the power of the elven host, when Thangorodrim is brought down, right? This is during the Council of Elrond, the comparably difficult chapter in The Lord of the Rings. He references the power of the elven host of Beleriand, one of only 2 direct references to Beleriand in The Lord of the Rings. One is the power of the elven host when Thangorodrim was cast down. The other is much, much later in Shelob's Lair, when Frodo says of Sting, there were webs of horror in the dark ravines of Beleriand when it was forged. So kind of echoing that same sense of that deep, deep lore of a world at that time completely unseen and completely opaque. This is also the Council of Elrond, of course, is also where Elrond says, Eärendil was my sire, who was born in Gondolin before its fall, and my mother was Elwing, daughter of Dior, son of Luthien of Doriath, right? We're getting all of this impression of depth from Elrond in that scene, which I love. But here we're getting the opportunity to pay some of it off. And I think that is a conscious choice. Nowhere is that more conscious, I think, than in one of the most interesting characters in the Legendarium entirely, and certainly one of the most interesting. If you listened to my previous podcast on The Lord of the Rings, you will know how much I love Treebeard. And I have to quote here the chant of Treebeard. This is the Willomeads song here. In the Willomeads of Tesserine, excuse me, see, I'm going to mess it up straight from the beginning. There's a lot of words here that I need to navigate. In the Willomeads of Tessarion, I walked in the spring. Ah, the sight and the smell of the spring in Nantessarion. And I said that it was good. I wandered in summer in the elmwoods of Assyriand. Ah, the light and the music in the summer by the 7 rivers of Asir. And I thought that was best. To the beaches of Neldareth I came in the autumn. Ah, the gold and the red and the sighing of leaves in the autumn in Tower na Neldor. It was more than my desire. To the pine trees upon the highland of Dorthonion I climbed in the winter. Ah, the wind and the whiteness and the black branches of winter upon Orod Nathon. My voice went up and sang in the sky. And now all these lands lie under the wave. And I walk in Ambarona, in Tauremorna, in Andalome, in my own land, in the country of Fangorn, where the roots are long and the years lie thicker than the leaves in Tauremornalome. I love Treebeard, you guys. And I love this moment. This is, of course, when he's just chanting to himself as he moves through the forest carrying Merry and Pippin. And we're seeing, of course, Tolkien's love of language in action, not language as a sterile created thing sitting in a collection of yellow legal pads in front of you, but as language that is put to use, as language that is wielded here to create beauty, which is the function of language, is the function, really, I would argue, in Tolkien's Imaginarium, at least, of every act of secondary creation. So we're deepening the Legendarium. It's rich, it's beautiful. You know, we're getting so many here. I should call out some of these, shouldn't I? Tessarinan, I suppose, Tessarinan. This is the Land of the Willows. This is the Willowmead, which we're going to see directly as we move through the rest of tonight's reading. Assyrian, we've already met, of course, the land of the 7 rivers down there in the southeast, where now the Lyquendi live after the death of Denethor during that first battle. Neldareth in Doriath is the birthplace of the aforementioned Luthien Tenuvial, of course. Tower na Neldor is the Quenya version of that same thing. This is the forest of beech trees, right? We get the beech trees reference there. Dorthonion, you'll remember this is one of the places where Thingol told the Noldor they could go and live because no one else is living there. The sons of Finarfin, including Finrod, will wind up there before Finrod moves on to Nargothrond. Orod Nathon is a mountain in Dorthonion, literally means pine mountain, like mountain of the pines. And then Ambarona, Tauremorna, Aldalome, that is Eastern Land, Black Forest, Tree Twilight, all in the Quenya, all of which are referring, as Treebeard makes clear here, to the country of Fangorn, right? He has been exiled from Beleriand, of all these places where he used to go, when he walked in the spring in Nantessarion, when he walked in the summer in Assyriand, when he walked in the autumn in Tower na Neldor, and when he walked in the winter in the highlands of Dorthonion. All of that is gone because this land has sunk beneath the wave, right? These lands lie under the wave. Now I walk in Ambarona, in Tauremorna, in Aldalome, in my own land, in the country of Fangorn, where the roots are long and the years lie thicker than the leaves, in Tauremornalome. Tauremornalome, you can see there the development of Tauremorna and that last little chunk of Aldalome there, right? Tauremornalome is the twilight of the Black Forest. He is now just in Fangorn. He doesn't get to wander the beauty of Beleriand anymore. So we read this in The Lord of the Rings and we are fired up. I think that everyone wants to know more about this land that has vanished, this land that has been taken, right? We're thinking of the Atlantis myth. We're thinking of a land to the west that vanished beneath the waves. How exciting, how cool, how amazing. And so we get some payoff to that. All of which is to say, I'm taking so much longer talking about the reasons for talking about this than I am spending talking about it. But the good news is we're not going to talk about it that much. I'm going to choose not to represent here on the slides before you every single word of this chapter. I'm instead going to sketch some of it, and we're going to get to parts of it. Parts of it are absolutely necessary, right? For example, the intro to the whole chapter. This is the fashion of the lands into which the Noldor came in the north of the western regions of Middle-earth in the ancient days. And here also is told of the manner in which the chieftains of the Eldar held their lands in the leaguer upon Morgoth in the Dagor Aglareb, the third battle in the Wars of Beleriand. It is precise, it is clinical, it is historical, right? We're really in this historical mode that we've noted before. This feels completely dissimilar to the previous chapter and completely dissimilar from the following chapter too. But this is where we are. We are now after, we are post Dagor Aglareb, we are post the glorious battle, the third battle in the Wars of Beleriand. This is our status quo. This is what Beleriand looks like so that we can move with purpose into the story of what comes next. We're going to begin here by pulling directly from the chapter and taking a look at Angband and the Land of Mist. In the north of the world, Melkor had in ages past reared Ered Engrin, the Iron Mountains, as a fence to his citadel of Autumno, and they stood upon the borders of the regions of everlasting cold in a great curve from east to west. Behind the walls of Ered Engrin in the west, where they bent back northwards, Melkor built another fortress as a defense against assault that might come from Valinor. And when he came back to Middle-earth, as has been told, he took up his abode in the endless dungeons of Angband, the Hells of Iron. For in the war of the powers of the Valar, in their haste to overthrow him in his great stronghold of Autumno, they did not wholly destroy Angband, nor search out all its deep places. Beneath Ered Engrin, he made a great tunnel, which issued south of the mountains, and there he made a mighty gate. But above this gate, and behind it even to the mountains, he piled the thunderous towers of Thangorodrim, that were made of the ash and slag of his subterranean furnaces and the vast refuse of his tunnelings. They were black and desolate and exceedingly lofty, and smoke issued from their tops, dark and foul upon the northern sky. Before the gates of Angband, filth and desolation spread southward for many miles over the wide plain of Ardgalan. But after the coming of the sun, rich grass arose there, and while Angband was besieged and its gates shut, there were green things, even among the pits and broken rocks before the doors of hell. It's a real insight into Professor Tolkien's philosophy here, that even in this foul place, while the siege lasts, while the gates of Angband are sealed, while the sun shines down upon it, green things will return, grass will grow, beauty will come, even to this afflicted, benighted place. So there are those who argue, taken from this passage, that the Thangorodrim described here as being made of ash and slag of his subterranean furnaces and the vast refuse of his tunnelings, that these are not real mountains, that these are instead, piles of trash, just piles of refuse rock taken out from the tunnelings beneath Angband. And I mean, I'm going to go to bat for the idea that no, the peaks of Thangorodrim are real mountains. You guys, they're volcanoes. They're huge. They are immense. They are lofty. They are exceedingly lofty. When we see them compared to the Iron Mountains surrounding them, they are spoken of as being higher. And the peaks of the Iron Mountains, we're told, are impassable because of the ice and snow which top them. And from those thrust Thangorodrim. So my argument here is going to be that they are real mountains, that this is metaphorical language. There's a really interesting phenomenon, and I'm not going to go too deeply into this because I just spent a lot of time talking about why I'm talking about this chapter at all. There's an interesting phenomenon in the critical study, and I'm hesitating there to note, yes, in the critical study and in the fandom, right? In the informed fandom of Professor Tolkien's work. There's a real tendency caused by Professor Tolkien's approach to his own work and his casual dislike of allegory, most famously, of course, but also his desire to avoid a kind of dismissal of his work on the grounds of insubstantiability, right? There's little here beyond the metaphor of Middle-earth. He invests a great deal of creative energy into this fiction, into the legendarium as a whole, and the desires that legendarium not simply be dismissed, right? So we, as good readers, as fans of Professor Tolkien, follow those instructions to the letter. We do not cite allegory when we are discussing the works of Professor Tolkien. We don't simply render it as, and it's a fairy story. Magic, a wizard did it, We don't play those kinds of casually dismissive games with the works of Professor Tolkien that we would easily play with any other fantasy author in any other time and place. And we do that out of respect. But I think sometimes we do it to excess. It leads some readers to take what is aesthetically clearly metaphorical and misconstrue it, right? To pay too close attention to each individual word and too little attention to the aesthetic impression that the professor is painstakingly attempting to give us. Now, this is such an example, right? The peaks of Thangorodrim are not just mountains of rubble. They are mountains. They are volcanoes. There is, the reeking smoke from the summits of Thangorodrim. That, to me, is pretty clear, despite this assertion that they are made of ash and slag of his subterranean furnaces, right? They're not just trash thrown out the front gate of Angband here. Another example, to pick one that I've discussed before, and one where I think I am maybe less in the majority. I don't know what most scholars think of this, but the stone giants in The Hobbit, the great figures that are beating seven hells out of each other as our heroes are trying to cross the Misty Mountains, that lead to them taking refuge in the cave that leads them then down to Goblin Town, right? This image of two great stone figures battling amidst the thunderstorm of the Misty Mountains is a metaphor. There's not really, despite what Peter Jackson will tell you in his film adaptation, two big rock'em sock'em robots beating the hell out of each other and being completely oblivious to the presence of our adventuring party at that point. And the reason that we know that is a metaphor is that those giants aren't ever mentioned again, and Tolkien is not the kind of author to create a force like that in the world and then not give them an accounting, right? Not explain their presence there, but also not to include them as we move through the much more rigorous descriptions of the military politic in the end of the Third Age as we move toward the War of the Ring, right? So just an example here of how I think some readers, in our commitment to Professor Tolkien's work, can be blinded to the beauty of metaphor and can be blinded to the broader aesthetic impression that Professor Tolkien is trying to give us. So we have this vast tunnel that is dug by Morgoth. We have the great gates of Angband that we've had mention of before. We have the filth and desolation, and we have the sun rising over this landscape, and still the grass will grow. From this point, we learn that Fingolfin and Fingon take up residence in the northwest of Beleriand, including the fortress of Ethel-Sirion on the east side of the Mountains of Shadow, from which they have a straight run to Angband should they need one. Turgon takes Nevrast, right? We've just discussed how Turgon keeps returning to Nevrast, the coastal region to the west and the southwest along the Firth of Drengist. He builds his home in Vinyamar, which we have previously mentioned. The thing about Vinyamar is that it is under Mount Taurus, which is the westernmost point in all of Beleriand. So when we see Turgon yearning for Valinor, yearning to recreate Tirion upon Tuna, it is no coincidence at all that he makes his home very far from Angband, like as far basically as you can be and still be in Beleriand from Angband. He chooses the westernmost point on the coast, as close to Valinor as he can reasonably be. We can see from that, I think, a great reading of Turgon's frame of mind. Then we move into our next slide and the discussion of Dorthonion, and the first of a very famous name here. South of Ardgalan, the great highland named Dorthonion stretched for 60 leagues from west to east. Great pine forests it bore, especially on its northern and western sides. By gentle slopes from the plain, it rose to a bleak and lofty land, where lay many tarns at the feet of bare tors whose heads were higher than the peaks of Eredwethrin. But southward, where it looked toward Doriath, it fell suddenly in dreadful precipices. From the northern slopes of Dorthonion, Angrod and Aignor, sons of Finarfin, looked out over the fields of Ardgalan, and were the vassal of their brother Finrod, lord of Nargothrond. Their people were few, for the land was barren, and the great highlands behind were deemed to be a bulwark that Morgoth would not seek to cross. Between Dorthonion and the shadowy mountains there was a narrow vale, whose sheer walls were clad with pines, but the vale itself was green, for the river Sirion flowed through it, hastening toward Beleriand. Finrod held the pass of Sirion, and upon the isle of Tolsirion in the midst of the river he built a mighty watchtower, Minas Tirith. But after Nargothrond was made, he committed that fortress mostly to the keeping of Orodreth, his brother. So we're continuing to build these fortresses, these standing emplacements bounding Angband as best we can. We have this construction of Minas Tirith, which I guess I should get to first, right? Literally a Tower of the Guard. It obviously won't be the last structure to bear that name in Middle-earth. This is basically the Ithel-Sirion, the fortress basically due west of Angband, is on the east side of the mountains. This is in that cleft south-southeast on the Sirion itself, right, northwest of Gondolin, blocking this pass between the mountains carved by the river. Galadriel is calling out here in the chat, I think of this as a kind of explanation of how mountains form. Not that it's not a real mountain, but that some mountains, volcanoes, etc., have deeper parts of how they form. Like there's some natural aspects to the formation and some almost supernatural aspects. Absolutely, Galadriel, I think that is completely correct. I think that that is the absolute unification of the metaphor and the etiological myth there, right? That it is an uprising of subterranean rock, that it is volcanic rock, right? That it is the slag from the furnace. If you've seen volcanic rock in real life, I think that that's a perfect accounting for it. And we're kind of, we're coupling this idea of Morgoth creating this impenetrable fortress, this impenetrable barrier, and this explanatory myth. I think you're right on the money there. Yeah. So we have these fortresses. We're kind of associating certain people with them now. We've got Angrod and Aignor, sons of Finarfin, looking out over the fields of Ardgallan. And now we're going to move south to Doriath. Oh, we'll note as well, this moment here that Finrod holds the Pass of Syrians. Finrod is the one who builds Minas Tirith here. But then he passes it, after Nargothrond is constructed, he passes it basically to Orodreth, his brother, who presumably just lives there, just keeping an eye. Again, we're seeing how actively militarized the Noldor have become. And we have to question whether or not this is a good thing. We have to question whether this is the will of Iluvatar. We have to question whether the elves were intended to be this National Guard kind of force, just constantly standing at the ready, constantly manning these fortresses, constantly keeping one weather eye on the foe. All because of the oath, of course, of Feanor, which is going to come to fruition very soon. So then we, let me see where we are here. Yes, we then get the details of the rivers of Western Beleriand. I have kind of skipped over this. We get the Sirion, we get the Narog, we get the Nenning from east to west. We acknowledge that the Falathrim, those Teleri who came down to the shore but did not board Tol Eressëa to journey to Valinor, right? Who hung around there under the leadership of Círdan the Shipwright, of course, famous in legend. That they are still there. They are friends, in fact, with the Noldor. They are friends specifically with Finrod, who is nearby. We then turn our attention to the left bank of the Sirion, as it is flowing. That is from north to south, the left bank, which is eastern Beleriand. Pausing to note, of course, that Ungoliant is still an active presence in the Ered Gorgodoth, in the Mountains of Terror. From there, we pause at Doriath, and I will read this part. Southward lay the guarded woods of Doriath, abode of Thingol the hidden king, into whose realm none passed save by his will. Its northern and lesser part, the forest of Neldoreth, was bounded east and south by the dark river Esgalduin, which bent westward in the midst of the land, and between Aros and Esgalduin lay the denser and greater woods of Region. Upon the southern bank of Esgalduin, save where it turned westward towards Sirion, were the caves of Menegroth, and all Doriath lay east of Sirion, save for a narrow region of woodland between the meeting of Teiglin and Sirion and the Meres of Twilight. By the people of Doriath, this wood was called Nivrim, the West March. Great oak trees grew there, and it also was encompassed within the girdle of Melian, so some portion of Sirion, which she loved in reverence of Ulmo, should be wholly under the power of Thingol. I don't think that this comes as a surprise exactly, but I think it's interesting to look at how we navigate the distinction between Thingol and Melian. That Doriath is protected by Melian. It is the girdle of Melian. It is her power as a Maya that protects this realm. But that power is exercised at the command of her king. At the command of her husband, yes, but at the command of her king. She has chosen to be of the Sindar of Doriath. And that is the consequence, right? Is that the king says, what is up? It's interesting that she chooses to extend the girdle there to encompass some portion of the Sirion just because she loves Ulmo. Just because, out of reverence for the Valar, she extends the area of her influence there. So this is our core. This is the heart of Beleriand. This is the hidden realm. Thingol, the hidden king. Doriath cannot be broached except at the will of Thingol, the king. We're going to be looking specifically at how that plays out in the slides to come. So we then follow the Sirion south through the Island Ewell, the Meres of Twilight, which we've mentioned before here. We reach this unusual geographic feature where the Sirion plunges into the depths and flows beneath the Undram Mountains, the Undram Mountains, the long wall in Sindarin, only for the Sirion to emerge 3 leagues, 9 miles further south just a fascinating geographical detail. I don't know how that works in real life. Maybe there are places in the world where that actually happens. I know that there are subterranean rivers, but I wonder if, surface rivers become subterranean rivers and then re-emerge again. I'm not sure what the forces of erosion would be doing at that point, but it's fascinating nonetheless, and extremely romantic too. We also note the Amon Ereb far to the east of the Long Wall, and throughout this chapter, but specifically I think in the Amon Ereb, we're getting like typological foreshadowing. I mentioned typology as the study of these reflections and echoes and reinstantiations of familiar archetypal characters or scenarios or conflicts as we move through these large and extended bodies of work. And we're seeing an example of that here because Amon Ereb, the lonely hill in the east, of course echoes Erebor, the lonely mountain in the east. We're seeing a certain familiarity, a reflection there, right down to the name. It is upon Amon Ereb, we are told, that Denethor died during the first battle of Beleriand, that unnamed battle back before the Noldor returned to Middle-earth, that led to the Nandor retreating into their forests in the southeast and becoming the Lyquendi, becoming the Green Elves. We then track the Lyquendi further east into Asyriant, which is fairly familiar to us, I guess, past the River Gallion. We spent some time talking about the Gallion, the easternmost river in Beleriand, and then we swing north into the Vale of Gallion. We reach the Hill of Himring, the capital and the fortress of Maithros, right, the eldest son of Feanor, who took himself to this gap in the mountains, the marches of Maithros, so that he has an unimpeded run at Angband, and will presumably be the recipient of the forces of Angband should Melkor ever move forth again, right? And then we note that still further east of Maithros, we get Caranthir building his home on the shores of Lake Helvern in the east. And then we get this. Thus, the sons of Feanor under Maithros were the lords of East Beleriand, and their power and their people, were in that time mostly in the north of the land, and southward they rode only to hunt in the greenwoods. But there Amrod and Amras had their abode, and they came seldom northward while the siege lasted. And there also other of the elf lords would ride at times, even from afar, for the land was wild but very fair. Of these Finrod Felagund came most often, for he had great love of wandering, and he came even into Asyriand, and won the friendship of the Green Elves. But none of the Noldor went ever over Ered Lindon while their realm lasted, and little news and late came into Beleriand of what passed in the regions of the east. So, we've covered all of Beleriand and its many realms, and we've done that in order to establish this political situation. And the specifics of the political situation are kind of hard to get to, but also we can distill out something that's fairly easy. Let's call up the map again, and I'll just give you a sketch here, okay? Because we basically have 4 operative political units in Beleriand at this point, right? We have, of course, Thingol and Melian and the Sindar here in Doriath, right? Here in the middle of Doriath, right here in the forests of Neldoreth to the north and Rhegion to the south. So that's Thingol's domain. That's the girdle of Melian. That's pretty stable and pretty hidden. It's also, kind of unconquerable. To the east, all the way over here, we have the Sons of Feanor. The Sons of Feanor have taken this part of Beleriand. We have Maithros here, right? We have the Mountain of Himring. We have the March of Maithros here. We have Caranthir over here by Lake Halavorn. They are pretty stable. There they hold all of eastern Beleriand. The Lyquendi, the Green Elves, who now live down here and to a certain extent in the forest here, don't really come in the story anymore, and who can blame them? To the west of Doriath, though, through West Beleriand and curving around to Dorthonion, we're getting the Sons of Finarfin, right? This is basically everything here that kind of falls under the shadow of west of the Syrian, except for this forest here, all the way out to the River Nenning is basically all of Finrod's holding there. This is incredibly hard to try and parse. It's so hard to describe these visual things just while not overlaying them. I guess I should have maybe spent some time building a diagram operative here. We then have this also holds curving. This is curving around to the north here, up by the Anfalglith. Right, we've got Ithilsarion here. We have Tolsarion here in the middle. That is where Minas Tirith is. So this is one continuous realm here of the Sons of Finarfin, and then we have Fingolfin up here in the northwest, holding Hithlum, Dorloman, Mithrim, Nevrast, right? This over here, Mount Taurus, this is where Turgon is currently living. He's about to relocate all the way to Gondolin, which you can see here. I don't even know if you guys can follow my my mouse pointer here, but, take a look at it, take some time to study these relevant places. What's important is that we get the sense that the House of Fingolfin is in the northwest. The Sons of Finarfin are in western Beleriand. The Sons of Feanor are in northeastern Beleriand. And Doriath, occupies the middle space. That's basically what we have to get. The Falas there on the southwest, still held by Círdan, but less important than the realms of the Noldor and Doriath itself. And we'll remember, of course, that Angband on this map cannot be seen. It is just to the kind of the northeast here. It's 150 leagues, 450 miles from Menegroth. You'll remember Menegroth is right here. I hope you can see that on the live broadcast. I'll mark all of these things on the slides after the fact. So it's 450 miles from Menegroth, somewhere up just north of where my pointer is there. So that is chapter 14. And now we can get back to the story. How does that sound? Glorfin David is joining us. Sorry I'm so late today. Glorfin David, it's completely okay. You haven't really missed that much. We covered about 450 years. But, you'll be able to catch up with the podcast after the fact. It's good to have you with us. So, Turgon, meanwhile, as we move back into chapter 15 of the Noldor in Beleriand, and maybe I'll even have enough time to get through all of this tonight, which would be fantastic, we see Turgon going to Gondolin. It has been told how, by the guidance of Ulmo, Turgon of Nevrast discovered the hidden vale of Tumladen, and that, as was after known, lay east of the upper waters of Cirion in a ring of mountains tall and sheer, and no living thing came there save the eagles of Thorondor. But there was a deep way under the mountains, delved in the darkness of the world by waters that flowed to join the streams of Cirion, and this way Turgon found, and so came to the green plain amid the mountains, and saw the island hill that stood there of hard, smooth stone, for the vale had been a great lake in ancient days. Then Turgon knew that he had found the place of his desire, and he resolved to build there a fair city, a memorial of Tirion upon Tuna. But he returned to Nevrast, and remained there in peace, though he pondered ever in his thought how he should accomplish his design. Now, after the Dagor-Aglarab, the unquiet that Ulmo set in his heart returned to him, and he summoned many of the hardiest and most skilled of his people, and led them secretly to the hidden vale, where they might begin the building of the city that Turgon had devised. And they set a watch all about it, that none might come upon their work from without, and the power of Ulmo that ran in Cirion protected them. But Turgon dwelt still, for the most part, in Nevrast, until it came to pass that at last the city was full wrought after 52 years of secret toil. It is said that Turgon appointed its name to be Ondolinde in the speech of the elves of Valinor, the rock of the music of water, for there were fountains upon the hill. But in the Sindarin tongue the name was changed, and it became Gondolin, the hidden rock. Then Turgon prepared to depart from Nevrast and leave his halls in Vinyamar beside the sea, and there Ulmo came to him once again and spoke with him, and he said, "Now thou shalt go at last to Gondolin, Turgon, and I shall maintain my power in the vale of Cirion and in all the waters therein, so that none shall mark thy going. Nor shall any find there the hidden entrance against thy will. Longest of all the realms of the Eldalier shall Gondolin stand against Melkor, but love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart. And remember that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west, and cometh from the sea." So, there's so much to talk about here, right? We got the timeline stuff first, I guess. We rewind all the way from 455 of the years of the sun to 64 of the years of the sun, basically 400 years, and to Turgon's mission from Ulmo to build this secret city safe and sheltered. It takes, as we learn, 52 years to secretly build Gondolin, which is completed in 116 YS. This, for context, is 150 years before Glaurung first ventures forth from Angband. So we have rewound history a long way into the events of the previous but one chapter. So here we get the founding of Gondolin, right? Of all the places of power within the Legendarium, this one has a certain mythic quality, right? We're urged almost to compare it to Menegroth. We're urged almost to compare it to obviously Tirion upon Tuna, and it falters in that comparison for really interesting reasons, which we'll get to in, I think, the next slide. But it is still a remarkable accomplishment, and we can see that, I think, even in its names, right? Turgon tries to name it in Quenya. He tries to name it Ondolinde, right? The speech of the elves of Valinor, the rock of the music of water, for there were fountains upon the hill. But no, it doesn't get that mellifluous name. It doesn't get Tirion upon Tuna. It doesn't get Alqualonde. It gets Gondolin. It gets a Sindarin name. It gets something very straightforward, hidden rock, right? Not even particularly mellifluous or poetic in its meaning there. What's most interesting, I think, well, we're going to talk a little more about the prophecy of Ulmo in just a moment, but I do want to stick for a second right here, because he's giving prophecy already, right? That he will maintain his power in the Vale of Sirion and in all the waters therein, and none shall mark thy going, nor shall any find there a hidden entrance against thy will. Longest of all the realms of the Eldalier shall Gondolin stand against Melkor. Gondolin is going to be the last place. This attempt to build a hidden city, it works, but it is going to fall, right? Because implicit within that longest of all the realms of the Eldalier shall Gondolin stand against Melkor. Well, yes, it will stand the longest, but it will too fall. But love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart. Ulmo here giving voice to the recurring, if you can distill out all Professor Tolkien's work, maybe the biggest philosophical bullet point in that list is that in the end, evil is always turned to good and yet shall remain evil, as Mando says, right? That evil acts only generate more good. That is like bullet point number one on things Professor Tolkien believes to be true. But the second thing that is oftentimes inextricably connected to that first thing is love not too well the work of thy hands and the devices of thy heart. Do not fall into a Melkorian trap here. Do not fall into a Feanorian trap here. Resist it. You are going to build something incredible. But remember that is not the point. The thing that you build ought not to be loved. It ought to be used, right? It ought to be loved appropriately, yes, as your home, but not as a thing of your own making, not excessively. Remember, furthermore, that the true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea. I'm sorry, what? Ulmo? Who counseled against bringing the elves to Valinor in the first place, who was the one dissenting voice in that council, in fact. Ulmo is now committed to the idea, it seems, that actually, no, all the elves do really belong in Valinor. They do really belong in the west and cometh from the sea. The true hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea. You're going to be separated here, but remember that the connection here is, well, and I guess we should be careful, right? We're not necessarily saying that Ulmo believes that the Noldor should return. That would, of course, be wrong, right? That's not exactly what he's talking about. That it comes from the sea, that there is still a connection between the Noldor and Valinor. That Ulmo has, to some extent, kind of I don't know, what normalized the presence of the elves in Valinor there, and I'm just realizing that I'm covering up a little bit of that text that I'm discussing right now. Yes, exactly right. As Gladrebecki points out, the third philosophical point might be the world is dying and is only a temporary home. Yes, and that you should be glad of that because you are not made for this world. The elves are made for this world, and look what happens to them, right? It is the gift of man that we diminish and that we go on to something else. That is something that we ought to be grateful for. We, of course, can discuss philosophically, theologically, how we feel about that. But yeah, you're right. That is an absolutely inextricable part of not even Tolkien's philosophy, right? But very much his cosmology, his theology, his understanding of how the world works. It's as much a part of Tolkien's theology as the notion of eucatastrophe itself, the notion of a benevolent God underpinning this chaotic world. So, some hope of the Noldor lieth in the west and cometh from the sea. We'll get to that in the chapters to come, and we'll also get to this. And Ulmo warned Turgon that he also lay under the doom of Mandos, which Ulmo had no power to remove. Thus it may come to pass, he said, that the curse of the Noldor shall find thee too ere the end, and treason awake within thy walls. Then they shall, then they shall be in peril of fire. But if this peril draweth nigh indeed, then even from Neverest one shall come to warn thee, and from him beyond ruin and fire hope shall be born for elves and men. Leave therefore in this house arms and a sword, that in years to come he may find them, and thus shalt thou know him and not be deceived. And Ulmo declared to Turgon of what kind and stature should be the helm and mail and sword that he left behind. Then Ulmo returned to the sea, and Turgon sent forth all his people, even to a third part of the Noldor of Fingolfin's following, and a yet greater host of the Sindar, and they passed away, company by company, secretly, under the shadows of Ered Wethrin, and they came unseen to Gondolin, and none knew whither they had gone. And last of all Turgon arose, and went with his household silently through the hills, and past the gates of the mountains, and they were shut behind him. The prophecy here, even more specific, even more... I'm struggling now with how deeply I want to go into this, given that we're 90 minutes into tonight's session. We still have a distance to go, and my voice is faltering by the moment. we're going to get the opportunity to talk about this messenger, this person who shall fit the helm and mail and sword that Turgon leaves behind in Neverest, right? This messenger who will come to warn Gondolin of betrayal, of treachery, right? We're talking, for those of you who have read the Silmarillion, you will know that we're talking about Tuor. For those of you who don't know the Silmarillion, it doesn't matter that you know that we're talking about Tuor because he hasn't shown up yet. We're going to get to him, really. He's going to be introduced in Chapter 21, I want to say, but really we get his story in Chapter 23. So again, I'm tempted to put just a giant pin in this topic and come back to it at that point. But I do want us to be thinking about this power of prophecy because it does seem distinct from the kind of foretelling, the kind of feelings that we have had before from the Valar about the fates of the children of Iluvatar, right? You remember that the children of Iluvatar are the children of Iluvatar. They are not of the make of the Valar in the way that the rest of the world 100% is. They awaken themselves at Cuivanen with no contribution from the Valar en masse. And their judgments on the judgments of the Valar with regard to the children of Iluvatar have always been like a little bit soft. They couldn't make war against Melkor because they didn't know where the children would wake. They wanted to bring the children to Valinor as a safety measure, except Ulmo didn't, right? He wanted to push back against that. He wanted to leave them in Middle-earth where their gifts and the presence of Iluvatar by proxy could start to heal the ills of the world, which we have certainly seen a little bit in Beleriand here, thanks to the people of Thingol and Melian who have stayed behind, thanks to the Sindar who have remained here. We've always been just a little bit soft. Remember when Aule makes the dwarves, and he makes the dwarves in the image of the children of Iluvatar, except he doesn't really know what the children of Iluvatar look like, so he kind of gets it wrong, right? He just creates these stunted and unlovely creatures, right? The Naugrim, as the elves name them. That seems to me to be more consistent. The one person who kind of has clarity about the future consistently is Mondos. Now, has Mondos given Ulmo direct instruction? We can maybe speculate that that's the case, but I don't know. I'm not sure that I lean into that completely, particularly with the emphasis that's given here on Ulmo's connection to the water, right? Ulmo we have heard before back in, was it back in the Valaquenta? We heard that Ulmo hears all, right? Because of his presence in the water, he hears things from much further away than even Manwë and Varda atop Taniquetal, right? Glorfin David said, do you think Tolkien realized and they passed away had a dual meaning? Yes, 100%. Yes, 100%, right? And last of all, Turgon arose and went with his household silently through the hills and passed the gates in the mountains, and they were shut behind him. Yes, this is a necessary thing, an inevitable consequence of this militarization of the Noldor that we've been discussing tonight, but also not good. Right, there's nothing, and this is what I keep coming back to this idea of, somewhat defensively coming back to this idea of this like almost linguistically aesthetic approach to reading Tolkien through the Silmarillion and kind of getting a sense of what sense does he want to give us? What is the emotional content? How is he delivering this story to us? This could have been seen as something victorious or at least something wise, right? We have the elves of Doriath in Doriath, protected by the girdle of Melian. Excuse me. It's not as though being protected is a bad thing. Doriath is clearly a really cool place to live. This feels different. And not just because of this foreshadowing of Ulmo. This is a hiding away in a recreation of the past. Let's remember that, right? Like Gondolin, for all its beauty, is a recreation. In fact, you know what? Let's move forth because we're going to have more opportunity to talk about this as we get the better description of Gondolin. But yes, Glorfin David, I think you're absolutely right. We're definitely getting a heavy inference here that things are about to turn really, really bad, right? It's been consistent throughout tonight's reading. So as we say, Gondolin is now shuttered, receiving a third of all of the House of Fingolfin and an even larger number of Sindar. We got that accounting earlier of how in some parts of Beleriand, the Noldor and the Sindar have become welded together as one people, though the Noldor remain, superior in every way that you care to measure to their poor Sindarin brethren, their Morroquendan brethren. But here we see that, in Gondolin, there is a large Sindar population as well as this large Noldor population of the House of Fingolfin. So let's cut ahead here. Through many long years, none passed inward thereafter, save Hurin and Huor only. And the host of Turgon never came forth until the year of lamentation, after 350 years and more. But behind the circle of the mountains, the people of Turgon grew and throve, and they put forth their skill in labour unceasing, so that Gondolin upon Amon Gwareth became fair indeed, and fit to compare even with elven Tirion beyond the sea. High and white were its walls, and smooth its stairs, and tall and strong was the tower of the king. There shining fountains played, and in the courts of Turgon stood images of the trees of old, which Turgon himself wrought with elven craft. And the tree which he made of gold was named Glingal, and the tree whose flowers he made of silver was named Belthil. But fairer than all the wonders of Gondolin was Idril, Turgon's daughter, she that was called Celebrindle, and Silverfoot, whose hair was the gold of Laurelin before the coming of Melkor. Thus Turgon lived long in bliss, but Nevrast was desolate, and remained empty of living folk until the ruin of Beleriand. Again, we're just continually pulling back. And then a good thing happened. For a while, but darkness lurked on the edges of elven society in Beleriand, right? We're contrasting this. Well, excuse me. I'm not sure exactly how far down the road of this interpretive maneuver we want to go, how fully confident we can be in this interpretive maneuver, but there is, I think, here a certain sterility to Gondolin. Yes, it is beautiful, but it is beautiful in replica. Became fair indeed and fit to compare even with elven Tirion beyond the sea. Not better, not even as good as, but like of the same order of, right? It would be foolish to say that Gondolin was better than Tirion upon Tuna, but like you could make an argument. You could certainly, like, it belongs in the conversation, even if it's going to receive like a participation trophy and nothing else. High and white were its walls, and smooth its stairs, and tall and strong was the tower of the king. There shining fountains played, and in the courts of Turgon stood images of the trees of old. Oh, wow. He's really replicating this city. Excuse me. He's really replicating Tirion. And you'll remember here, too, that what he's imitating here is not directly Telperion and Laurelin, because they were not in Tirion upon Tuna. What he's replicating here are the trees that Yavanna gifted to Tirion in kind of in reflection, in imitation of Telperion and Laurelin themselves. But here, Turgon makes imitation trees, right? We're now 2 steps removed from the great trees of Valinor themselves. Yeah, well, I do want to talk. Well, no. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking we really don't have time to talk about Huor and Hurin entering Gondolin. This date that we get here for the Year of Lamentation, 350 years and more. This takes us to 472 of the Years of the Sun. That's a little past where we were before at 455. This is the latest date that we have thus far, but it's obviously still a long way in the future. Belthil, I wanted to call out here, the tree of silver. Belthil means divine radiance, and Glingal meaning hanging flame. But they are not the treasure of Gondolin. For all of Turgon's craft and art here, right? Turgon himself wrought with elven craft. For all that he has put his spirit into these things, they are not what makes this place special. What makes this place special is the people. Asgard, it turns out, was never a place, it was a people. As you can tell by the number of times that we went to Asgard, the place. Instead, it's Idril, it's Turgon's daughter, right? Celebrindle, the Silverfoot, literal translation there. We don't, interestingly, in all of Tolkien's works, we don't get a translation. We don't get a gloss of the name Idril. It's not completely clear what the name Idril means. It obviously has like a certain phonotactic similarity to other names that we get in Sindarin, but yeah, it is distinct, and no one's really 100% sure exactly what it means, but she is special. She is also, to those of you who have read the Silmarillion before, as you will already be aware, also a foreshadowing of the coming of Tuor, right? Just as Ulmo is saying, yeah, make a suit of armor and a helm and a sword and leave those things in Nevrast, because someone will someday need them, and you will need to know that he is the guy that you are supposed to trust. Also, you know, here is the woman who is going to marry Tuor someday. Let's skip ahead to that, right? But even without this ominous presence of prophecy, we can feel the pressure of the future being applied to Gondolin, being levied against Gondolin. Yeah, Galadriel Becky says Gondolin sounds a lot like Lord of the Rings Minas Tirith. Yes, absolutely. But and in the same way, right? That Minas Tirith is a fortified fallback position. It is the Tower of the Guard. It is what is left, and it can be spectacular, but that's not what should be happening, right? In Arda Unmarred, there would be no need for fortresses. In Arda Unmarred, as we can now infer, we don't know this, of course, when we get to the Lord of the Rings, and we might be just presuming standard elements within a kind of fantasy schematic. in Arda unmarred, there would presumably be no need of swords. We would have the slender bows of the Teleri for hunting and for adventuring, right? But we wouldn't have swords given to us in idea alone by Melkor, right? It would be a very different kind of world. And I think that we're sensing this pushback against militarism. I have still a good number of slides. I have still, 6, 8 slides left. My voice, as you can hear, is giving out a little bit. So what I want to do is oh boy, the next passage is so good. Let's do the first. Let's just do the first one. Let's get to the point where the Silmarillion passes the Bechdel test with Galadriel and Melian, because for right now, we're going to leave with this ominous cloud, right? Remained empty, the contrast of Gondolin and Nevrast. Nevrast was desolate and remained empty of living folk until the ruin of Beleriand, because Turgon turns his back on the closest point of Beleriand to Valinor and instead goes to this like replica of a chunk of Valinor here within the encircling mountains, just trapped and cut off. Years and years, right? 350 years and more. No one comes to Gondolin save Húrin and Huor, who we will talk about in the chapters to come. Let's get back, though, to Doriath. Now, while the city of Gondolin was building in secret, Finrod Felagund wrought in the deep places of Nargothrond. But Galadriel, his sister, dwelt, as had been told, in Thingol's realm in Doriath. And at times Melian and Galadriel would speak together of Valinor and the bliss of old. But beyond the dark hour of the death of the trees, Galadriel would not go, but ever fell silent. And on a time Melian said, "There is some woe that lies upon you and your kin. That I can see in you. But all else is hidden from me, for by no vision or thought can I perceive anything that passed or passes in the west. A shadow lies over all the land of Aman and reaches far out over the sea. Why will you not tell me more? For that woe is past," said Galadriel, "and I would take what joy is here left untroubled by memory. And maybe there is woe enough yet to come, though still hope may seem bright." Then Melian looked in her eyes and said, "I believe not that the Noldor came forth as messengers of the Valar, as was said at first, not though they came at the very hour of our need. For they speak never of the Valar, nor have their high lords brought any message to Thingol, whether from Manwë or Ulmo, or even from Olwë the king's brother, and his own folk that went over the sea. For what cause, Galadriel, were the high people of the Noldor driven forth as exiles from Aman? Of what evil lies on the sons of Fëanor that they are so haughty and so fell? Do I not strike near the truth?" "Near," said Galadriel, "save that we were not driven forth, but came of our own will, and against that of the Valar. And through great peril and in despite of the Valar, for this purpose we came to take vengeance upon Morgoth and regain what he stole." To gloss the Bechdel test, to which I am casually referring, the Bechdel-Wallace test. The Bechdel-Wallace test was created by cartoonist Alison Bechdel. It demands, this is a test of it's a very superficial test. Let me note that here very powerfully and emphatically. It's a very superficial test that kind of gives a sense of how feminist a text is, how well a particular text is treating its female characters. It demands a bare minimum. It demands that the text include 2 named female characters who talk to each other about something other than a man. And here it is. The Hobbit does not pass the Bechdel test. The Lord of the Rings does not pass the Bechdel test. The Silmarillion, though, does, because here we have 2 incredibly powerful women engaged in a discussion of politics and the uncovering of the truth. At last, we're getting the secret history of the Noldor. It's interesting here that Melian notes that she cannot perceive anything that passed or passes in the west. A shadow lies over all the land of Aman. I'm not sure if we're supposed to interpret that as being a recent event. I'm not sure if we're supposed to interpret that as being, when the Valar raise the Pelori even higher and make them even sharper and steeper and really fortify Aman, and they set forth the islands with their soporific magic out there in the bay. We're told that only one skilled mariner shall ever pass them, who's getting closer and closer to appearing on the page in front of us, by the way. I'm not sure if this is a consequence of that, or if this is because it bears a striking similarity, a kind of typographic similarity to the entry into Arda of the Valar, right? Of the Valar and the Maiar, both. That when the Ainur who choose to come into Arda enter the world, enter creation, right? They see they hear the music, they contribute to the music, they see the vision, and then they choose to enter into Arda. That is it. They are bound. They are locked off. They cannot directly communicate with anything that is outside of Arda. They are here for the long haul. They won't leave until the end of time. They won't leave until we reach the end of whatever this project is going to be. And I wonder if we see something similar here with Melian, that she has entered into the east, that she has come into Beleriand and chosen to remain. and that has severed her in some functional, meaningful way from the West, or if this is a consequence of the guarding of the West, of the shrouding of the West following the flight of the Noldor in the first place. So this, I just think this is fantastic. You know, I talked earlier about getting back into that, you know, fantasy story mode where we're getting characters and dialogue, and it's maybe even easy to forget how good Professor Tolkien is at this stuff. But this conversation, I think, is so strong. There is some woe that lies upon you and your kin. I can see it in you, but all else is hidden from me. Why will you not tell me more, right? I already know that there's something wrong, and I'm not asking you even what it is. What I'm asking you is, why won't you tell me what it is? And Galadriel answers here, honestly, so she believes, for that woe is past, and I would take what joy is here untroubled by memory. And maybe there is woe enough yet to come, though still hope may seem bright, right? The world was real bad there for a bit, and seems like it's going to be real bad again. Galadriel here having also some measure of foresight in this moment. And I don't want to talk about things that are done, things that are resolved, things that I can't change. Then Melian looked in her eyes and said, hey, this story that we have of because you happen to arrive at this really convenient moment for us, we held that you came as emissaries of the Valar, that you came at their urging to aid us, except y'all don't talk about the Valar. Y'all don't talk about Olwe, the brother of Thingol, in whose court you are living right now, right? You don't mention anything that happened back there. Why? And moreover, for what cause, Galadriel, were the High King of the Noldor driven forth as exiles, the High People, of the Noldor, driven forth as exiles from Aman, right? She's reading that correctly. Or what evil lies on the sons of Fëanor that they are so haughty and so foul? This is not about interpreting the past. This is about recognizing characteristics of the sons of Fëanor. They are troubled. They are so haughty. They are so prideful, right? And they are so foul. They are so dangerous. There is a darkness on the sons of Fëanor specifically, right? We don't trust, really, any of the Noldor, right? There's a kinship here, and we can accept that. And you know, Thingol is, as we're going to see in the slides to come, a good king, a wise king, but something is wrong here. And Melian lays it out, and Galadriel kind of acquiesces, right? Near, you're almost there, save that we weren't driven forth, but came of our own will, and against that of the Valar. True. Technically true, right? And through great peril and in despite of the Valar, for this purpose we came to take vengeance upon Morgoth and regain what he stole. Yes, right? Vengeance upon Morgoth for what? Because we talked about how this narrative of vengeance kind of fell out of Fëanor's story once he arrived back in Beleriand, even before he arrived back in Beleriand, honestly, right? Originally, we will go to have vengeance upon Morgoth for the death of Finwë, my father. We will go and atone for this injustice, right? We will demand atonement from Morgoth for this injustice. But really, it's just about the Silmarils. And that's what Galadriel is now going to explain. I think maybe, oh boy, no, okay, you know what? We're going to do one more because it's so good. And then we're going to pull Melian out to go and talk with Thingol. And that will give us a natural break point in tonight's reading, so we can wrap up and push on to next week. But we'll do one more here at the end of all things. Then Galadriel spoke to Melian of the Silmarils and of the slaying of King Finwë at Formenos, but still she said no word of the oath, nor of the kinslaying, nor of the burning of the ships at Losgar. But Melian said, now much you tell me, and yet more I perceive. A darkness you would cast over the long road from Tirion, but I see evil there, which Thingol should learn from his guidance. Maybe, said Galadriel, but not of me. And Melian spoke then no more of these matters with Galadriel, but she told to King Thingol all that she had heard of the Silmarils. This is a great matter, she said, greater indeed than the Noldor themselves understand, for the light of Aman and the fate of Arda lie locked now in these things, the work of Fëanor who is gone. They shall not be recovered, I foretell, by any power of the Eldar, and the world shall be broken in battles that are to come, ere they are wrested from Morgoth. See now, Fëanor they have slain, and many another, as I guess, but first of all the deaths that they brought, and yet shall bring, was Finwë your friend. Morgoth slew him, ere he fled from Aman. Again, just the rhythm of the dialogue here, I think, so fantastic, and so, I mean, who among us comes to the Silmarillion not already loving Galadriel? Who among us doesn't feel that little heart skip when we see her name on the page for the first time? And who isn't thrilled that now we're getting really her only scene, her only real scene in the entire book? But she is so fantastic here. All of this poise, the rhythm of Melian's speech here as she's outlining her well, her knowledge now and also her foresight, right? Now much you tell me, and yet more I perceive. A darkness you would cast over the long road from Tirion. Oh, you're trying to obscure exactly what happened from the moment you left Tirion to the moment you got here. But I see evil there, which Thingol should learn for his guidance. Thingol should know this so that he can be the best king that he can be. Maybe, said Galadriel, but not of me. I'm not going to tell him. It's not down to me. She's not saying anything about the oath or the kinslaying or the burning of the swan boats of Aqualunde at Losgar. She's concealing this. She's not lying exactly, right? This is very much a kind of a lie of omission, right? She's just not telling, but she's even basically admitting by implication that there is more that she's not telling them, but it is not her choice to tell them. She is choosing to not get into this story right now. And we might count her among the wise, frankly, because when the story does come out, it's going to break real bad. And maybe, you know, I don't know how we navigate this particular thorny issue, except to remember that for Tolkien, it is the act itself. The act itself is where we determine the morality of any action, not in the consequence of that action. So maybe we are to hold Galadriel at fault here. Maybe she should be honest here in this moment. Maybe she should follow this Kantian categorical imperative and behave as though everyone ought to behave, right? She should set the standard in the expectation that everyone will follow her and thus live in a more just world. This notion of honesty here would be a good one, but Galadriel is not uncomplicated. There's a reason that she's going to face her final test by the time that we get to the Lord of the Rings, right? So Melian speaks no more of this with Galadriel and instead goes to Thingol, tells him of the Silmarils, and warns him, right? The light of Aman and the fate of Arda lie locked now in these things, the work of Feanor who is gone, and it's going to be a bad time. We're not going to be able to recover them by any power of the Eldar, and the world shall be broken in battles that are to come ere they are wrested from Morgoth. Bad things are coming because of actions that are already set in motion, and actions that find the elves of Doriath basically innocent, right? Like, they didn't do this. They didn't contribute basically anything to what is going on here, and we still haven't got to the actual confrontation, which of course we will get to in the slides to come. Unfortunately, I think that is going to do it for tonight. We're only 4 slides out, but we are closing in on the 2-hour mark, and as you can hear, my voice is fading fast. So I think we're going to wrap it there. We will pick up the last 4 slides in the confrontation here. We're going to have some great speechifying here as we move through the end of this chapter. And then we're going to pick up next week with chapters 16 and 17. Let me show you the slide here for our schedule to come. So next week we will finish up chapter 15. We'll cover 16 and 17. Let me get to my notes here. Oh, right. 16 of Maeglin, who is the worst, and then 17 of the coming of man into the west. We will cover that on Thursday, April 10th. We'll be back to our regular Thursday slot next week for the foreseeable future. We're going to be back to Thursdays for a while. Then the following week will take us on to chapter 18. We're only covering one chapter that week, and it's a big one. That is of the ruin of Beleriand and the fall of Fingolfin. We'll cover that on April 17th. Then the following week, you guys, we get to Beren and Luthien, just to kind of give you a little carrot here, just to lead us forward through some dark times ahead. Then we get to Beren and Luthien, which is, of course, just fantastic. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Stars and Swords. Thank you all so much for listening. Galadriel Becky, Glorfin David, thank you so much for joining me live. It has been an absolute pleasure, as always. I'm looking forward to continuing our journey through. Do stay tuned for some upcoming announcements, because we are going to set in stone basically the schedule for the rest of the year. I've got, as I've said before, a new Tolkien podcast just in the hopper. It is ready to come. So when we finish the Silmarillion, I will be able to effortlessly segue into an entirely new undertaking. I'm really excited about that show and about the format that I'm going to adopt for that show, which is going to be, I think, both challenging and rewarding and kind of conversational. It's going to be very kind of community oriented in an interesting way. So that's going to be a great show. But I also want to lay out basically a sketch of our next 3 or 4 units, depending on what we choose to cover for Stars and Swords. If you would like to be a part of that conversation, and if you would like particularly to cast your vote to choose which books we cover, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/nextword, where you can follow along for free in order to get the links to these weekly live sessions. There are going to be many more weekly live sessions in the future for the new Tolkien show too. And you can also pledge your financial support. You can send me the price of a cup of coffee or a good pint of beer at the Prancing Pony every month in order to help me keep making these podcasts. It's just a machine for turning here. I'll just disembody myself. I am a machine for turning money and primarily coffee into more podcast hours. If you head on over there and pledge your support, you can get access to our exclusive Discord where you can hang out and we can chat about the work that we've already done and the work that lies ahead. And of course, you can cast your votes to choose which books we cover next through the end of the year for Stars and Swords. I'm really looking forward to covering some classic fiction. I've been talking a little about Jane Austen. I think we're going to do something there. We're going to probably cover some, I think maybe modern horror this year. We covered Dracula last year that got completely out of hand for Halloween. But I think maybe this year some modern horror as we move through, and then maybe squeeze in something in November before we return to the works of C.S. Lewis in December, of course, with The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. There's so much ahead, and all of it is good. No evil foreshadowing here. No shadow still lurking in the north for this particular podcast. Only good times ahead, right? Our hope still shines bright. That is going to do it for this week's show, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Silmarillion heirs, hail to you all. Godspeed. I will talk to you all again soon.